now, and I can see folk are joining us. Right, I make it 8 o'clock. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this month's live conversation with the author of our featured book in Beyond Adventure. So that's a slightly different subscription to Adventurous Inc. So it sends people everything that you get in Adventurous Inc., but you also get an extra deep read every 2 months. So you get 3 books every 2 months. And in July and August, it was this wonderful book, Forecast, by Joe Shute. Now, if I can find Joe, I will bring him in. There we go. Hello, Joe.
Hi.
Thanks for joining us. So you're in Sheffield? Yes,
based in Sheffield. Been here for about 5 years now, despite the accent.
Well, people wouldn't necessarily place my accent as Leeds or Doncaster. Well, we may as well get the northern stuff out of the way to start off with. So it's one of the reasons I love the book is because it features so many places that I knew, and I really thought that was very special because it's so rare that places in the north get talked about in nature writing. So that was one of the reasons that I loved it, and particularly the place where I grew up, the very flat bit just north of Doncaster, where they obviously had a big flood, which features in the book. So we'll talk a little bit about Fish Lake in a moment. So welcome to everyone who's joining us. I know we've got a bit of a mix tonight. So some of you are here because you've won a reward as part of the competition with Sidetrack. So hello everyone who's new to this. If it's your first one, this is the way it works basically. I waffle on a bit, we chat with an author. I've got a bit of a structure here, but really this is our conversation. That's why we do it this way, as opposed to it being a webinar and kind of everyone being shut out and there being the host, me and the author. It's meant to be much more interactive. So if you've got any questions, do pop them in the chat. If you want to ask a question live, you're welcome to raise your hand, but I'm more likely to see a chat popping up than I am if you raise your hand. If you can see I don't know what version of Zoom you're on. If you've got one of those fancy Q&A things, don't bother with that. It's either chat or raise your hand, or even just unmute yourself and go, Tim, can I ask a question? That's the way it works. And welcome to keep your cameras on, leave them off. It's completely up to you. Joe and I will be pinned most of the way through the session, so no one can peer too deeply into your living room, bedroom, kitchen, outhouse, wherever you might be. So feel free to chip in as we go along, and we will be done at 9 o'clock. And we've got a huge amount to fit in, because I mean, it's a fabulous book. Obviously, all the books that we feature are brilliant, but it wasn't just the fact that it was based in the north, featured somewhere where I grew up, that really drew me to Joe's book. I love the way he weaves culture and climate and ecology, weaves all those threads together in a very sensitive sort of manner, and I think it reflects the nature of most of our lives. If we're into our books and into the outdoors, Joe's book really weaves those two things together wonderfully. So it's a great opportunity to have a chat with him. So thank you, Joe. As well as your book being the first that properly addresses climate change, and we will obviously talk about that because let's face it, it's kind of the topic of the moment. It was also one of the first which had come out after the pandemic and properly addresses it. A lot of the books we've featured so far sort of had postscripts about the pandemic or kind of alluded to it, but yours is fully been through it, out the other side, published a book. So how was lockdown for you? I mean, you touched on it in the book. You talk about going places with your press card and being able to go where others couldn't. So how was your lockdown? What was your lockdown experience like?
Well, I wasn't very locked down really. As some of you may know, my day job, aside from writing books, is as a journalist. I'm a feature writer on the daily Telegraph, and lots of my job before the pandemic is about sort of traveling around the country and traveling abroad as well, interviewing people, kind of going to find stories and so on. I'd reported on epidemics before. Actually, I was in West Africa during the big Ebola outbreak there in 2014, I think it was, off the top of my head. So I'd actually done a bit of sort of reporting in that kind of environment before, and it was a real sort of stark moment when a story like that lands kind of on your doorstep, as it did, as the pandemic did for absolutely each and every one of us. You know, we were all living this thing. Being a journalist, I was surprised to hear early in the pandemic that we were supposedly key workers, which I'd never been called before, so I felt very honoured. And as part of that, we were allowed to travel around basically and tell stories and report on the pandemic. So in those first few weeks, when I'm sure you'll all remember, none of us knew what was happening. It was a very sort of terrifying time when the Queen was doing that talk, the address to the nation, and Boris Johnson did his early kind of lockdown thing. My paper sent me out, and my job was to go on a road trip basically for the best part of a week. It was about a week and a half, to drive all over the country from the south coast in Eastbourne all the way up to Cumbria and kind of everywhere, and just report on what people were doing, what it looked like. It was totally bizarre. I opened the book like this. It actually came right at the end of me writing the book, but it's how I begin it, because me and the photographer, we were just driving down the A1, up the A1, south to north, and there was not a car on the road. It was the most bizarre thing. We stopped off at service stations, and the only sign of life would be kind of blinking Costa coffee machines. It was deeply, it was like the apocalypse, basically. And it felt quite fitting to some of the themes in the book as well. So yeah, that's where I started it.
Hopefully it wasn't too much of a taste of things to come. We'll talk about a taste of things to come in a moment. But you grew up in Lincolnshire, didn't you?
No, I grew up in London. My mum is from Lincolnshire, and my dad is from Yorkshire. So you can probably tell from my accent, I grew up in central London with not much access to green space. But on summer holidays, I would always go and visit grandparents, either it was Boston, Lincolnshire, where my mum's mum lived, and the North York Moors, which was where my maternal grandmother lived. And that was really, it was those early summer trips that I really got my love for the northern landscapes that you talk about, Tim, and nature in general. You know, that kind of, that feeling that you can't get in London, of just that sort of expansiveness. And particularly to sort of these species that just seem so alien, you know, the upland species, things like curlew and lapwing and grey wagtail and raven. I love a previous book I've written is actually about ravens. I love them so much. And yeah, I mean, I've always, that kind of from an early age gave me a love of the North. I went to Leeds University, read history there, and then started my career as a journalist in local papers in the North. I worked on a paper called the Halifax Evening Courier for a couple of years, and actually lived in a place called Sorby Bridge, kind of on the tops of in a real sort of Pennine town, kind of on the tops of the moors, and then worked for the Yorkshire Post for a time. I was their crime correspondent for a while, and then moved to the Telegraph after that, about 10 years ago now.
And so did that, and I think it's really clear from your writing, you've got this really close connection with the natural world. Did you, when you left university, was there an aspiration to be able to use that in your career, or was that more accidental?
It was more accidental, actually. What I knew I had from early on from university, and before that actually, was always loved writing, but particularly loved sort of people as well, and stories. And I'd had that in every kind of, you know, all the jobs that we all do as kids, working in pubs. And for a time in Leeds, I was worked as the security guard at a local cinema there. And all those kind, you know, when you're that kind of age and you first sort of get out into the world and meet people and hear these kind of crazy stories, and that's really what led me into journalism. Nature was always just something, just a passion, just something that I enjoyed really. And it's kind of over the course of my career, nature and weather and climate has become the story. You know, that wasn't the case when I started off. There's a famous journalism book called Scoop that some of you may have heard of, by Evelyn Waugh, and his main character in that is a guy. He does what I do now for the Telegraph, basically, which he writes a very small sort of nature column. And back in the 30s or whatever, it was a kind of ridiculous thing to do. And he, and it's kind of, you know, a sort of real kind of backwater. And it's funny, I sometimes think of that now, and the way that the climate and the weather and nature and the natural world, because of what's happening to it, has become elevated to this huge, huge story. It's, you know, leads the news every day at the moment, as it rightly should. And yeah, so we kind of, I guess the two, it was a bit, yeah, the two sort of happened hand in hand, really. But yeah.
So I mean, I'm fascinated to know. But how do you? So once you're there as features writer at the Telegraph, do you kind of sidle up to someone in a bar and go, does anyone fancy a weather column, or does someone tap you on the shoulder and go, I've seen you spotting those clouds? Where did the weather bit come from? Because I think it's fab.
So the weather column existed long before me at the Telegraph. It's a bit of an institution at the paper,
Yeah.
and it's going to exist long after I've gone as well. I'm just the sort of current occupant of that berth. What happened was, soon after I started, the previous person who wrote it quit, and my features editor came up to me and said, you like folklore, and you like you know, kind of nature and stuff like that. Do you want to do this weather column? And I have to admit, I'd never even read it before. It's on the back page of the Saturday Telegraph. And I kind of said yes, as you always do to these opportunities when she came. And I said, what do you want me to write about? And her instruction was anything but the weather. And kind of left it at that. The only other thing she said was, don't try and forecast anything, whatever you do, which is where I got the title for this book, actually. So on my first ever column, I tried to stick to that instruction, but very stupidly, I remember it was a beautiful bank holiday weekend, one of those rare weekends in Britain when you look at the weather map and it's just a big sunshine over the whole of the British Isles. And I could see this, but then in the very far north over Shetland, there was a sort of rain cloud. And I thought I'd be very clever and, you know, I was kind of show off in my new column and said how everywhere was, you know, lovely apart from these poor shivering Shetland souls. I still remember it, thinking how pleased I was with my alliteration, where they were being sort of soaked in rain. Anyway, a few days later, on about Wednesday, a letter of complaint turned up on my desk, and it was from a Telegraph reader living in Shetland, and he said he'd only got round to reading the column on the Monday because there's a boat that takes the Telegraph out to Shetland, and that drops it off. He never gets around to reading it till the next day, but he wanted to assure me that I'd got it totally wrong, and it was a beautiful day in Shetland, and he said it's typical of the erroneous London-centric media reporting that I should get the weather wrong up there. But he also invited me to come and see it one day for myself. And I was terrified that I was going to lose the column over this, but I was also thrilled at the idea that something I'd written had made it all the way to the Shetland Islands, where someone had read it as well. And yeah, I've been doing it ever since.
It's funny you mentioned that, because I love that. I love that little quote. I was going to ask you if beyond that you had any other favourite readers' responses.
I mean, compared to anything else I write for the paper, the amount of letters that I get sent about the weather column is just incomparable. And it's, I keep every one of them and try to reply to as many as possible. But I mean, it's stacks. I've got a folder and it must be hundreds and hundreds of letters. And really that's where the book came from, because so much of the letters is people just talking about the weather as they see it and their own personal experience of the weather, and how the weather as they knew it is changing, and the impact that that's having on their gardens, for example. People write in to tell me about flowers that always came into bloom at a certain time of year and now aren't doing that. They're coming into bloom far earlier. They write to me about birds that have visited their gardens for decades and decades, and they're not seeing them anymore, or they're coming earlier, or they're staying later. All these sorts of changes in the natural world that the making happen. So these kind of letters, this idea of the way that the weather is something that's personal, and the weather as a tool for memory, really fascinates me. And that's really what I want this book to be about. I want it to be a book of memories, of all of our memories of the weather. We all have them. And often they're very nostalgic. I'm interested in how our weather memories are sort of imperfect. Our mind plays tricks on us. We only remember the sort of beautiful summer days and the snowy winters and those kind of perfect, crisp autumn mornings. And we forget all the times when the weather hasn't been like that and it hasn't sort of lived up to our assumptions or our expectations. So the idea of the book, much like going back to my crime correspondent days, I suppose, was kind of being a bit of a sort of detective and looking through to see how the weather was changing and what that impact was on us and the natural world.
And that must have been quite difficult, because obviously the weather is changing and we can see that. And I think it's fascinating the way you document it in your book. But you must have had to unpick that from that nostalgia that you talk about. So people would remember things that didn't necessarily happen, or conflate things. Was that easy? Was that important, unpicking it like that, or do you just accept it that that's kind of part of that wonderful warp and weft of the way memory and our remembrance of places works?
Yeah, it's a bit of both, actually, Tim. I had a moment in researching the book. So 30 years on from the Great Storm it was 1987, wasn't it, off the top of my head now?
Was it 87 or 86? One or the other.
I
would bow to your superiority.
Yeah. Anyway, 30 years on from
Google
that.
it and let us know in the chat.
87. Thank you, Dawn.
There we go.
I went to a wood in the south of England where millions of trees are uprooted during this storm, and I wanted to see what the wood looked like 30 years on. It was fascinating. It was full of old sweet chestnut trees, and that had been blown over. And 30 years on, what would have been the branches out of these trees had turned into the trees themselves, and the roots had sort of gone, as the tree kind of molded into the ground, the roots had sort of splayed down there, and beetles, this particular wood had become a sort of national site of a fantastic array of beetles. And I interviewed Michael Fish as well, the man who famously didn't predict it. And when I was interviewing Michael Fish and kind of looking through these old records of the storm, I realized that one of my own memories of the storm was completely made up. And I was only 3 years old at the time. And in my head, and for my whole life, I told this story endless times. I was walking with my parents past Highbury Corner Magistrates Court, which is near to where we used to live. And it was so windy, I held onto a lamppost and the wind blew my feet up and I was holding onto this lamppost. And it was gospel in my mind. And it was only actually looking through the history of the storm and realizing that it happened, overnight and very early in the morning, those incredible gusts. And there was no way could have been out there at all. And then I asked my parents and they said, no, that never happened either. And it really sort of, it was a real moment of what else have I invented of in my head of kind of how it is. So there was a part of that, a part of kind of revelation, I suppose. And then also a part of acceptance and actually taking pleasure in that as well, that nostalgia is a key part of the way we relate to the world. And to kind of accept that for what it is. We are imperfect, imprecise narrators of our own lives, which I found quite interesting, quite lovely, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've got to accept that as part of the human condition, haven't you? And we're not automata, we're not machines. We don't just take this stuff in and churn it back out as was. we sort of swirl it around and regurgitate it and I guess spew it back out in our own ways, which is a fascinating thing, isn't it? So how do you go about finding the subjects that you talk about? I mean, you said your editor that said, oh, you like folklore and you're into nature. So do the stories present themselves? Do you have, obviously some do, but when there isn't an obvious story to talk about, where do you go for inspiration?
I often go living in Sheffield up into the Peak District, and as I said from the start, it's very often people. One of the main characters in the book is a farmer who lives not far from me at all, a man called John Elliott, and he's a cattle farmer, and he owns a number of fields near a village called Hathersedge. And I came across him completely by chance. I was out cycling with a friend, and it was a sort of lovely summer's day in the Peak District. It was the time of year for well dressing in the Peak District, which I'm sure you'll know, Tim, and some people may. It's a kind of a sort of particular time of festivities when lots of villages have their buntings out, and people do this ancient sort of practice of kind of dressing the local wells in kind of community artwork. And anyway, we were cycling past this field, and I saw 4 kids who were aged from about 20 down to about 11, each in their own mini tractor, haymaking, driving in strips along this field, cutting the long meadow grass ready for it to be baled. And each mini tractor was followed by this kind of platoon of swifts, those amazing screaming birds that were kind of hawking down on the insects that were drifting up as they cut this hay. It was just an amazing thing to see. It looked straight like I write about it in the book, it looked like a sort of Eric Ravilius painting or something like that. And on that occasion, I just went over and introduced myself and said I was, interested in stuff like this and writing a book. And John's wife, Sharon, invited me to their farmhouse. I went back another day. It was this beautiful old building that had been in the family for centuries. John's family have farmed this land for centuries. And we just spoke about their lives. And he spoke to me about how he's one of the only farmers in the Peak District now, still farming in the old ways. He kind of eschews all industrial techniques, refuses to use fertilizers on his ground. As a result, he has these amazing meadow flowers. And he talked above all about how he'd seen things changing. That year, it was 2018. It was a year of drought, almost unprecedented drought in the Peak District, where Lady Bower Reservoir, the levels sunk, which is a big reservoir in the middle of the Peak District near to John's house. The water level had sunk so low that an abandoned village that had been flooded in the 40s to create the reservoir, the old ruins of that village started to poke through the water. And I mean, you can read about this stuff in books, you can sort of look at the science of this stuff, but when you have someone like John, who's lived his entire life on that field at a level of intimacy that, very few of us manage to have with a landscape, and they're telling you those stories themselves, that for me is when they become so much more powerful. So that's why characters like him, I as much as possible, the old journalist in me, I suppose, I try and tell the story through people like his eyes, rather than just me sort of roaming around fields whittering on to myself.
Oh, but you tell his story so beautifully, Joe. That scene really jumped out at me from the book, and you've painted that picture again just perfectly. I could be there leaning on that stone wall, watching them the haymaking in the field. It's wonderful. It really is an absolute talent. Are you inspired by any writers? Because I mean, you make lots of references to writers from Defoe to Ruskin to so many other people. Is there anyone who you particularly the classical writers? Is there any, being a historian, is there anyone that you take inspiration from and you think, actually, if I could capture a little bit of what they're doing, I'd be doing all right?
Yeah, I mean, the list is too long to say, really. I'm inspired by loads of writers. The sort of beating literary heart of this book is a writer called Edward Thomas, who he actually wrote a famous poem which instantly came to my mind when I saw John Eliot, called Haymaking. And Edward Thomas, wrote about that process of cutting the hayfields a century ago, and it was amazing to see that played out in the modern era. But it was a book that he wrote called In Pursuit of Spring, and he wrote it in a sort of, he lived in a flat in London in the Edwardian era where he was kind of miserable, and he wrote about there, and I really associate with this, he wrote about sometimes there being no weather in London, where it's just either kind of light or dark or hot or cold, and the actual weather as we understand just doesn't exist. And he had enough of that one day and set off early one March in pursuit of spring, and he cycled all the way out through the West Country and just describe, I mean, it's a sort of travel story. He just describes, as he's cycling out through London, the suburbs that are kind of eating into the countryside. And he made the point that you see it now, where they're often, these new streets were often named after the very things they were destroying. You know, there was
it's horrendous, isn't it? The Hawthorns,
yeah,
or wherever.
And he writes one bit of his book that always sort of sticks in my mind, is he talks about the roadside sellers on the way out of London as he was cycling off, and there were people selling songbirds in a cage, and he describes these small songbirds like beating hearts in the cage as he was watching them go. And yeah, so he's a real inspiration for the book and in general as well. He died not long after writing it, actually. He was enlisted in the Artist Rifles in the First World War and was killed by a single bullet in the Battle of Arras, I think, in 1917. So he's one, but there are many more, many contemporary nature writers as well, I think fantastic. Helen MacDonald, H is for Hawk, is another writer who I love. This book actually was something, it's quite a personal book as well, in that there's a sort of a second narrative to it where I write about me and my wife, we're trying to have a baby and not being able to, and how that kind of fits into these sort of disrupted natural rhythms that are taking place around me. I'm kind of much more comfortable telling other people's stories rather than my own. And I'm not one of these journalists who kind of writes endlessly about their personal lives. So that was a big decision for us both to take, to put that in the book. She illustrates the book, actually, my wife. And it was, yeah, certainly H is for Hawk was something that I kind of lent on in that, because I feel like Helen MacDonald writes about her own book. She writes about coming to terms with the death of her father and having training a goshawk. And it's just so beautifully kind of done and so understated that I tried to sort of, like a magpie, steal some of that for my own book.
Well, I think you weaved it in beautifully, and I think what I took from it was, obviously there's a personal story there, but weaving it into a book about the natural world really shows that we're not separate from that natural world. You know, that you could kind of present that image for if you're maybe stuck in London where you don't have weather and you're not as open to the seasons. But I think it really brought through to me that we are all connected, and there are so many natural cycles, and we are part of a natural cycle, and we don't have any dominion over it or any greater power. Which, you know,
and our changing climate is disrupting so many sorts of natural breeding rhythms of so many animals as well. If we look at some of our kind of familiar species, things like blue tits, for example, great tits, they're now breeding at least 2 weeks earlier, often more. Things like swallows, that famous summer migrant, increasingly they're arriving earlier and earlier, a full fortnight earlier than they did a few decades ago. And often now in the southwest of the country, they're not even migrating back to Africa. It's warm enough for them to stay here all year round. And yeah, I mean, it runs right the way through nature. Everything's being sort of disrupted in this modern age.
But yeah, but I think I really think it shows how we're connected, and I love the theme of connection and disconnect, and you looked at both sides of that coin, and I think that's so much of what most of the writers that we talk to often talk about. In fact, you know, we've even talked in these conversations in the past about exactly the same thing as you were just mentioning there, about, you know, whole housing estates being named after the thing that was the natural thing that was there before. I wondered, so obviously the storytelling is fascinating, and it's what draws people in, but I was really struck when you were talking about Wainfleet and the floods that they had there, and how they blamed it on the badgers, and there's this idea that we always want to find a scapegoat, or a escape badger in their case. And do you feel a responsibility to challenge that, or do you try and address it without being challenging? Do you see what I'm asking? It's easy to paint the nice pastoral pictures, but actually there's something seriously wrong in our relationship with the natural world. Do you feel you need to challenge that, or do you think that's other people's role?
Sometimes I think I do. It depends on who the person is. So the Wainfleet example you mentioned. So part of my job of writing about the weather, or actually just as a feature writer, is reporting on these kind of extreme weather events around the country. So I've reported on endless floods all over the country, particularly in Yorkshire, wildfires, and the Wainfleet example was a couple of years ago, and in the summer actually there was a real unseasonal burst of record rainfall in about 24 hours that flooded a number of villages in Lincolnshire. And I went over there to meet some of the people in the evacuation shelter that I think it was the local town hall had been turned into. And there was a story doing the rounds there that it wasn't the record rainfall that had caused this flood. It was badgers burrowing sets into the river and destabilizing the riverbank. And I've heard this elsewhere with other things. The Somerset Levels, for example, in 2013 and 2014 had really bad flooding there. I went both years to report on it for the paper, and back then it was dredging, and people said, you know, the reason why this has happened is dredging. And I think it's a totally understandable, I think we all do it. If something bad happens, you focus on something that's easier to explain and easier to control. You know, if it's badgers, then we can just move the badgers on, or if it's dredging, we can just dredge the river. And that's a lot easier to kind of comprehend than the fact that we have changed the climate, and we're increasingly seeing these extreme bouts of rainfall that will lead to sort of flash flooding. In terms of challenging that, I often think as a journalist, it's not my place to do that. You're talking to people at moments of extreme crisis often, you know, and I think it's just, it's sort of listening to what they have to say and kind of reporting that, but not necessarily challenging that in that instance. Because let's be honest, if you've just had your house flooded out, the last thing you want is some journalist.
Absolutely. No, I definitely wasn't thinking in the instance.
But if it's, you know, if I'm interviewing an expert, for example, or if it's someone, if it's a kind of climate change denier, I can't tell you the number of emails I get from climate change deniers telling me that, you know, kind of whatever, just sort of, yeah, that the whole science is bogus and blah, blah, blah. And in that instance, I kind of sometimes do. But yeah, I think with everyone who I feature in the book, in terms of, you know, people who talk to me about their lives and experiences, I always try and just faithfully reflect that rather than pass judgment on it necessarily.
Yeah, no, I agree. And let's face it, now when you get those emails from the climate deniers, we've got handy 3 words to relay back to them, which comes from the IPCC, and it says it is unequivocal.
It doesn't matter. Trust me, Tim, it doesn't matter.
No, I know it doesn't. We're a long way from rational science, and that's not the way the world works. There's a lovely comment from Jeremy, who said, "I'm just reading In Pursuit of Spring at the moment." So there we go. Passing Salisbury on the way to Somerset. Very well read. Our community. So that's great. So we've mentioned it. Let's talk about the IPCC report. Has that been keeping you busy this week?
Yes, I've been interviewing British firefighters in Greece in the last couple of days who are out there at the moment, and they're part of a kind of international contingent who've been sent out there to help with that. I've got a colleague in Sicily today who's she's on holiday there, and she was talking about the temperatures of 48.8 degrees that they've recorded there.
I think we've got a participant from Sicily. Chiara's there, down in Sicily. Hi, Chiara.
I hope you're
there. You go, an international as well as a well-read audience.
And yeah, I mean, a lot of the kind of the science. I try. It's funny with the books. I try and I don't want to make it too, or I've deliberately tried not to make it too science heavy, because I feel like there's endless. You know, if you want to read a book that's about sort of the science of climate change and why this is happening, and the kind of global perspective, this isn't necessarily that book. I want to make it much more, what I wanted to do with this is make it much more about how climate change is impacting on the natural world, the 4 seasons, and kind of changing all of our everyday as well. And aside from those extreme weather events, which I do touch on in the book. I go to Portugal in the wake of the record wildfires they had there. There's a part of the book where I'm in Chad as well. I went there a few years ago to write about climate refugees and how climate change was kind of fueling conflict over in Lake Chad, which was once this huge watercourse, one of the biggest in Africa, and in the course of 50 years has shrunk by 98% of its size, which is just, we flew over it in a kind of tiny twin propeller plane looking down, and it's just, it's terrifying what's happened there. But equally, it's the kind of the book I want to, the book I tried to make this about is the sort of impact on nature, the impact on us, and also wherever possible to try and make it a hopeful book as well. And as the IPCC report says, there is still time and we can do stuff about this, and nature is resilient. I hope that to be one of the sort of the main messages of my book. And I mean nature then in the loosest possible sense. I include, us in that as well, that we are resilient and we can respond and we can change stuff, and we can change stuff for the better as well. I hope you agree, Tim, but I really wanted to make it a hopeful book.
Absolutely, I think it's a very hopeful book, but it's the way you tell the stories that I think that really bring it to life. So you talk about the soaked carpets and the evacuated dogs, and that makes it real to people, and it's that thing about the everything is in the individual, and those individual experiences we can all feel and touch that, and it makes sense to us all because we can all imagine having to put stuff on tables to stop it getting wrecked and all that sort of experience. So let's talk about Fish Lake and the experience, because this sort of connects you and I in a strange. Hang on, I'll pop back in for a minute. Let me. So it sort of connects you and I in a strange sort of way, because there you were up in Sheffield with the water coming down off the moors and being personally affected by it in your own home, and then all the way down the river down in Fish Lake they were there being affected by it, and bizarrely, as folk who've seen the reading from Saddleworth Moor know, Fish Lake is a place that I know quite well. It's sort of 3 villages away from the village where I grew up. I actually went to nursery in Fish Lake. My grandparents are buried in Kirk Bramouth, which is one of the villages next door. And my old geography teacher was the chap that you met whilst you were out there, which is a completely bizarre coincidence. He also taught me history, actually. We did have more than two teachers at my school, but yeah, he did teach history and geography. But I loved the way he was going to join us. He's actually writing his own book about the floods in Fish Lake, which is why he wasn't able to join us. He's up against his own deadline. Whether I'm going to forecast that, I'm not sure. But feature that, sorry. But I love the way you kind of took us all the way from the tops of the moors all the way down to the impact that it was having in Fish Lake. And for me, I'm a geographer by training. You know, it was geography by stealth.
Yeah, I mean, you see it so much in the north. My first experience of that type of flooding was when I was living in Sorby Bridge in the Calder Valley, where it's a very steep valley with moorland at the top. And so much of our moorland now is sadly is the same in the Peak District, is kind of degraded. We've drained a lot of these uplands that from their original state where they held back water, they were filled with, plants like sphagnum moss that would hold sphagnum moss. One of these beautiful little emerald green plants could hold up to 8 times its own body weight of water. And, this was in their hundreds of thousands, their millions all over the uplands of Britain. So we had these giant sorts of sponges. And in the 20th century, it was thought to be a good idea to drain those to improve water quality. So we reduced the capacity of the uplands to hold that back. So what happens now is when it rains, the water flows down through these kind of steep moorland rivers into conurbations. Sheffield had a terrible flood in 2007 and invested tens and tens of millions in new flood defences. And there's a very cruel arithmetic by which the government and the Treasury calculate flood defences, and it's essentially how many people live there. So Fish Lake was a real victim of this, where the money had gone to Sheffield because it was a bigger population, so there was less damage to property. There was more damage to property to be had. So the flood defences worked. Sheffield didn't really had like little bits, but nothing on the scale of 2007. This was November 2019, by the way, and the wettest November on record in Sheffield. The water kept flowing along the River Don, and as I write in the book, it had to end up somewhere. And very sadly, Fish Lake was where the river burst its banks. And the sort of scene there when I met your old geography teacher, he was wading through the village like so many other people. Just the amazing thing you see in floods, and you really saw it in Fish Lake, and I've seen it every flood I've ever covered, is the way people come together. It's always an extraordinary show of human nature and resilience. And Fish Lake, there was the local pub had turned into this kind of DOS house, come youth hostel, come sort of crisis shelter, where there were people literally sleeping under the bar stools. The local church turned into this sort of emergency drop-in centre filled with food donations from all over the country that had come in, and residents waded door to door, checking people had enough power for their phones and so on. Peter was one of those people. He is called Peter, isn't he, Tim?
Yeah.
And he was one of those people, and I met him. He was refusing to talk to any of the journalists, actually. And when I told him I was writing a weather book, he said, "Oh, all right then, come in." And we sat, he made me a cup of tea, and we sat in his flooded study, or the one room of the house that hadn't flooded, basically. And he explained to me in geographical terms exactly what was happening. And yeah, he was a lovely, sort of fascinating guy. I can't wait to read his book.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to it. And he told me afterwards he's now had a record number of flood wardens come forward. So I think he said something like 23 flood wardens have come forward. And Fish Lake is tiny, so I mean that's basically all of Fish Lake are now flood wardens. So there we go. There was something very interesting in your book when you talked about sometimes for people who lived in places that get flooded, it's almost a weight off their mind when it finally happens. And I've seen that with colleagues who when I used to have a job and worked in an office, and it would start to rain, there'd be some people who would instantly get jumpy because they had a stream that ran past their garden or something like that. It's a strange impact, isn't it? That mental torture of knowing that this could happen to someone.
In particularly in the Calder Valley, Hebden Bridge, which some of you will probably know, a town one along from where I used to live, and that's been, I think that's had 6 major floods in the last 10 years. And what they do now, I went there for my book, and it spent a lot of time talking to residents, people who live there, businesses and stuff. And what the council do now when the flood sirens go off is they dispatch specialist trauma teams down the valley as well, to be with people and spend time with people and address what they call environmental trauma. Because exactly as you say, as soon as it starts raining, all those kind of memories of what happened before start to sort of bubble up for people as well. And it can, it can be an incredibly traumatic episode, being flooded. So yeah, that's definitely a thing, and certainly something that we're sort of beginning to realize needs to be sort of properly addressed, along with, hauling out the damp furniture and making sure people have got enough sort of food and stuff. It's that addressing the kind of the emotional impact as well.
And I guess it's almost a microcosm of what is happening across the globe, because as climate extremes intensify, we're going to see more people displaced by climate, and I think, again, it's another one of those disconnects, I suppose, where people say, oh, well, climate change, and sea level's going to rise and it's going to flood some people, but we never accept that actually that extra heavy rainfall that floods your nan's garden, that's all part and parcel of the same thing, and it shows how we're all connected.
What they did in Hebden Bridge a few years ago was they came up with they were thinking how, to respond to that trauma and how to harness that sort of sense of togetherness that people have in the moment, which naturally, when the waters subside, kind of dwindles away a bit. So they decided to have a big community opera, which was all about being flooded. And the whole cast was people who'd been flooded. And I interviewed the director of it, and they held it in the Peace Hall in Halifax, which is this amazing open air, beautiful building in the heart of Halifax. And they had this whole sort of story about how they'd been flooded, and there was a family that cooked like 1,000 chicken biryanis for everybody, and sort of sung about that and stuff. And it was over a 4-day period, and for pretty much every performance, it completely bucketed it down. It's open air, this stuff. So these people were just standing there.
The irony
about the flooding, and it was apparently this moment of sort of real joy and togetherness. And I've used this word already tonight, but resilience as well, that, people come together in the face of this stuff as well.
Absolutely. I should just add, we've got about a quarter of an hour left, and I've rabbited on. No one's asked any questions. That's absolutely fine. I can keep rabbiting. If you do have questions for Joe, do chip in. But yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I've not heard about that, because I would have headed over to Halifax to check it out. And for me, I think it shows how, like you say, culture brings cohesion and community, and from that you get resilience. And particularly for someone like yourself who likes folklore, you must have an innate understanding of the deep importance of ritual, and it's something that I get a sense that we've lost the importance of. So it was lovely to see a flourishing of that there. Have you seen any other sort of cultural, ritually flourishing type things that gave you a sign for here's something of hopeful for communities in the future?
I wouldn't necessarily call it ritualistic, but for me, the sort of most hopeful part of the book was on Saddleworth Moor, where you by chance went up to read it, and I reported on there in 2018, I think it was, the massive wildfire that happened there, the biggest wildfire in generations on the moor. It was so big that it sent this giant ash cloud all the way over Manchester, and you could see it from space. It was, I remember I was in London that day actually, and my newspaper told me to kind of get up there as quickly as possible with a load of the rest of the journalists. And we were handed out masks by the firefighters when we arrived. And I remember at the time thinking, this is so weird wearing a mask and interviewing people. And yeah, funny how what happens as the years change. But anyway, I went back to, it was actually 2 years ago this day, because it was on the 12th of August. And I remember that because it was the beginning of the grouse shooting season, and there's a lot of grouse shoots happening up there. So gunshots were ringing around the moor as I travelled up. But I went there with to meet a woman called Kate Handley, and she is helping to re-wet the moor and basically restore it to its natural state in a way of safeguarding against future wildfire events and also protecting against floods as well. As I've talked a bit before, you know, returning it to this sort of sponge-like peat bog that soaks up water and stops fire as well. She took me to the line of where the fire hit the newly re-wetted moor. And it was amazing to see, even 1 year on, you could see this really clear line sort of marking the moor from the one side, the degraded moorland which had just gone up, and the other side where this sphagnum moss had sort of held the fire back. It's all being done by volunteers, basically, people going up on their weekends and days off and digging these mosses into the ground with the heel of a Wellington boot. It's not very technical what they do, but it works. And as well as sort of restoring the landscape, it's meant traditional things like old tree species, that all the trees had gone from up there, but things like rowan and willow and aspen had started to grow again. This small forest is establishing itself up there. And at the same time, nature is coming back, you know, really threatened, red listed species, things like curlew, dunlin, lapwing, all their breeding numbers are massively increasing there. And that for me was such a hopeful sign, you know, having seen it as kind of apocalyptic worst just a few years previously, where people have been evacuated from their homes and you couldn't even see them more for the sort of thick, acrid smoke that we're seeing, you know, those exact scenes replayed across Europe right now. But to go back just a year on and see how quickly the land could restore itself, and how sort of what small, simple action from us, you know, digging some plants into this moor, the knock-on effects of that, and how, as well as, you know, kind of mitigating against extreme weather, we're also helping nature restore itself as well. And on top of everything else, these peat bogs in their natural state store millions upon millions of tons of carbon as well. So there's these tiny little things we can do all over the country to make a massive difference, all over the world to make a massive difference. And that gave me real hope, really.
Good. I tell you the other thing that I got hope from in your book, and it was the first time I'd been introduced to it actually, and it was the Orbis spike, which was for those. Well, I'll let Joe explain what it is in a moment, but it's this tremendous thing that shows you how resilient the world is. But Joe, tell us about the Orbis spike and what that was and what happened and how we experienced it here, because it's very much that butterfly flaps its wings on the other side of the world, lots of butterflies, and the impact here. Yeah,
I mean, it was a kind of a good thing out of a terrible situation, I suppose. There was a big paper about this in Nature a few years ago, and this group of scientists had discovered this weird spike or fall in carbon emissions at the beginning of the 17th century, I want to say, or maybe 18th century. And it had led to a period of sort of cooling across the earth, and no one really could explain why. But these scientists put forward a quite compelling hypothesis that it was as a result of it coincided with the European conquests of the New World. And many of you will know, you know, these Europeans brought with them new unfamiliar diseases, things like smallpox, which very tragically, you know, kind of ravaged indigenous populations. What that meant was people who've been living, you know, huge communities of people who've been living in forests suddenly were no longer there. You know, whole villages, whole communities were wiped out. And as a result, it meant that they stopped cutting down the forests and stopped burning trees, and the forest began to sort of naturally regenerate. And the researchers called this the Orbis spike base, where it linked the decline in carbon emissions to these lowering temperatures. And they mark it as the beginning of something which I'm sure all of you will have heard of, the Anthropocene era, which we're sort of living through now, because they felt it was the first indication ever of man's impact, you know, us changing the climate.
Yeah, which is, and it's great because they think that those changes in America changed the climate by 2 degrees by the amount of extra plant growth that we had, and it just shows that resilience and the power of the natural world. Obviously, we'd like to be able to manage that sort of degree of global cooling without having to wipe out entire populations, because otherwise, let's face it, all of our populations are going to be wiped out. But for me, it was a fascinating insight as to how adaptable and resilient the natural world is on a mega scale. Because I'm sure we've all forgotten to weed our path and noticed how quickly the dandelions crop up through the cracks and everything else. In fact, I've got weed the block paving is on my to-do list actually. So there we go. It shows the resilience of the natural world. I took so much from the book, Joe, from the Orbis spike to the I love the idea of invertebrates marching north at 5 meters a day, and that whole thing. We've not talked a lot about the ecology that you drew out in the book, but for me again that was a real insight, and I've never, you know, we've talked in these conversations before about spring progressing north, but we've never talked about the impact of climate change on species progressing north. Clearly, that's only likely to continue, and other species are coming in. Do you think that we're the sort of mix of human and nature is capable of sustaining that as far as it can, or do you think we're going to start to increasingly see this 6 mass extinction sort of ramping up in its scale?
I mean, the long-term prognosis for climate change and British species, or species that we identify with in this country, isn't great. But the short-term one is a bit more mixed. If you look at, for example, an example I love of this is the humble ring-necked parakeet, which any of you living in the south of the country will constantly hear squawking outside your windows. They are the new pigeon of London, and even in Sheffield you hear them now. And even far beyond Sheffield, you know, they are a parrot, but they are also an invasive species that are benefiting very well here from our warmer winters, wetter, more sort of tropical summers as well. And they have spread as far as Glasgow. There is a flock of ringneck parakeets in Glasgow, which is officially the most northerly flock of parrots on Earth. And there's all kinds of examples like this in the natural world of some birds that are, in the short term at least, doing well out of climate change. Another one is long-tailed tits, which they're tiny birds. They're beautiful sort of pink fluffy bodies with long tails. They weigh about a pound coin each. And because of that sort of very delicate body composition, when in very cold winters, they do very badly and they'll die out essentially. It's the same with things like goldcrest and goldfinch as well to an extent. But they're all now doing really well. Their populations are massively on the increase. In my garden, we've got last winter more long-tailed tits than I've ever seen before. And you never see one of them. You always see them in big flocks, sort of barreling through the trees. Yeah, so there's all these kind of examples. Blackcaps are another one that traditionally would migrate in winter, but they're increasingly overwintering here as well. They're also doing very well out of garden bird feeders as well. So you do have these kind of, in the short term at least, this sort of winner and loser situation. And that's happening with plant life as well. One of the places I go in the book is a place called Renishaw Hall, which is just outside of Sheffield on the border with Derbyshire. And it's an old stately home. And back in the 70s, it was the most northerly vineyard in the world. The guy who ran the stately home, a guy called, he's got the poshest name I think I've ever heard, which is Sir Reresby Sitwell, I think, off the top of my head. I've never heard the name Reresby before. I loved it. Anyway, he, as well as owning this kind of country pile in Derbyshire, had a house in Chianti in Italy. And when he was out there, he kind of loved visiting all the vineyards and decided to try and grow his own vineyards in Derbyshire in the 70s. In it, when the kind of mills of industrial Sheffield were still sort of pouring black smoke towards him. And he grew this stuff, and it made wine that was so bad that he'd kind of, whenever his tenants had to come and pay the annual bills, he'd invite them in for a glass of wine. I interviewed a few of them. They said it was always this terrible experience because the kind of lord of the manor would pour this glass of horrible wine and sort of watch them as they drank it and pretended to sort of enjoy it. But now, because of climate change, they're growing not just good wine, but award-winning red wine, which typically requires much hotter temperatures than white wine. I went there, I joined in a harvest actually of the crop there, and they grow the vineyards in this beautiful old walled garden, and volunteers go and sort of take part in this harvest. It's a lovely kind of family thing to do. Yeah, I mean, this wine's winning awards. But in the break from the harvest, I went into the gardens, which are these sort of very big sculpted manicured gardens, and started chatting to a guy called David, who's been the head gardener there for the best part of 30 years. He remembers having to drink Sir Reresby's wine back in the day. And he was telling me, you know, as well as the benefit of the wine, the changes that he was seeing in the garden were profound. You know, they'd had to change. They traditionally had a bluebell fortnight, which always took place in March. And they'd had to change that to February because the flowers were coming up so much earlier. The crocuses always came up in February. And again, they had a sort of celebration of that. But now they're coming up in December. And he talked to, and again, this is the kind of nub of the book. You mentioned rituals, our weather rituals. And he talked about how those changes in the landscape and the changes in the sort of the ecology of the ground were changing the rituals of the stately home itself and altering their festivals. And I wonder in the book, you know, where does this take us? For example, Wales, St. David's Day, the daffodil is the symbol of that, and people wear them in their lapels on the 1st of March. But we're getting to a point where, you know, daffodils are being seen before Christmas. So what do we do then? You know, how far do we change our rituals, and how far do we change our own history to make sense of the present?
Mm. Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. Joe, we're going to have to call it. We're going to have to call it an end there. I love that, you know, we've ended on a bit of a high, that we might at least get slightly better wine grown in England. Let's make hay while the sun shines.
Yeah, he also said that in the south of England, where they're growing very nice wine now, that in 30 years they're only going to be able to grow sultanas. So.
Yeah, well, I think, you know, we're all going to have to deal with so much change and so much upheaval, and I'm sure that at times it's going to feel very difficult. But I think with folk like yourselves helping educate us and entertain us and tell us stories that we need to hear, then the culture is kind of going to find its role to help us through. And I love the book, obviously, but I love the fact that it's grappling with this big issue in a way that is trying to stop it being a big scary thing and make it a bit more real, and encourage people to allow it to be real and get over that disconnect and living in places where you never experience the weather because there isn't any. So more than entertaining, I think it's important, and I guess that's what I'm always looking for in the books that we feature, is something that does have something to tell us as well as something to entertain us. So thank you, Joe. I think you've made an excellent contribution to the canon there. I look forward to more stuff from you. Actually, I try not to talk about future books because if I say we're looking forward to a future book, then people expect it to be featured, and it gets very difficult.
I'll hold you to that. I'm writing the next one now, Tim.
There we go. See, authors always get their next book in. For now, it's forecast. So this is our Beyond Adventure feature. It will go in the back issue store from September. So if you want a copy and don't want to sign up to Beyond Adventure, it'll be in the back issue store from September. Although if you drop me an email, I'm sure I could sort you one out in the interim. Joe, it's been an absolute pleasure. I'm sorry we're only down the road and we've done it all over Tinternet, but that's the modern way of things. Right, I'll take us all off camera. We can all do the traditional wave goodbye. Joe,
thank you very much thank you very much for having me, and thank you everyone for giving up some of your time to listen to it as well. It's been a real pleasure.
I think the pleasure was all ours, Joe. So there's only the four of us have got our cameras on. If anyone else wants to pop their camera on and say goodbye, you're welcome to. We're going to cut it off in a minute. Thank you for all the kind comments in the chat as well. Thanks, Bob. Bob's looking reluctant. Oh, go on then. I'll put the camera on. And we got to see your lovely collection of guitars. Fabulous. Yeah. Right, Fab, I'm going to end it there. Thanks, everybody. It's been a pleasure. I shall, we're going to do it all again next time. We're chatting with this chap, Adam Weymouth, on the 26th of August. So that's only 2 weeks' time, isn't it? There we go. Adam Weymouth, 2 weeks' time. I shall see you all then. Joe, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.